Story 1. The Stranger in the Locked Room. There's something unsettling about cabins, especially when they're secluded, surrounded by nature's silence. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but filled with an eerie expectation. Stacy and I had been planning this trip to Vermont for months, just the two of us, escaping the grind of city life for a weekend among the vibrant autumn foliage. We rented the cabin on a website called Glamping Hub. It looked perfect in the photos, cozy, rustic, nestled on a hill with a stunning view of the fiery fall leaves. I thought it would be the perfect getaway for us, a break from the stress of our jobs and, frankly, the growing tension in our relationship. The cabin seemed like it would provide that little slice of tranquility we both needed. But when we arrived, something felt off, though I didn't want to admit it. The drive up was long and winding, the sun already setting by the time we reached the cabin. The owner had sent us a code to unlock the door, a modern touch on an otherwise old-fashioned place. As we stepped inside, the air hit me stale, with that distinct smell of wood that had been closed up for too long. The cabin was mostly furnished with wooden furniture, the walls paneled in timber that creaked with every step we took. There were 3 bedrooms, but only 2 were accessible. The third door was locked. Stacy wrinkled her nose as she wandered the cabin, running her hands along the worn countertops in the kitchen, checking the small, outdated appliances. "This place feels weird," she said, her voice trailing off as she stared at the locked door. "Why is this one locked?" "Maybe the owner keeps personal stuff in there," I shrugged, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. The last thing I wanted was for her to get paranoid. "We're only here for a couple of days. It's probably nothing." She didn't seem convinced, but we were both too tired to argue about it. After dinner in town, we collapsed into bed and fell into a restless sleep. The next day, it was overcast. The weather matched our mood. We hiked for a bit, hoping the fresh air would clear our heads, but the woods around the cabin were too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though the only things out there were trees tall, looming, and ancient. After we returned, I showered, and that's when Stacy told me she'd heard something. "It came from the locked room," she said, her face pale. "It sounded like a radio or a voice. I can't explain it." I laughed it off, trying to make light of it. "Maybe it's the owner's old clock radio," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Inside, I felt it too, the tension of something just out of sight, something watching us from the shadows. Later that evening, after Stacy had gone to bed, I heard it too. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was there. I muted the TV and crept toward the locked door. My hand hovered over the wood, my heart racing as I pressed my ear to the door. There it was again, muffled, indistinct, like someone talking in another room. A chill ran down my spine. I knocked, more out of curiosity than fear, but when nothing happened, I pulled my phone out and called the owner. "Hey, I'm not sure if this is important," I began, trying to sound calm, "but we've been hearing some noises coming from the locked room. You mentioned your wife might have left something in there?" The owner was quiet for a moment before he answered. "My wife? No, she didn't lock anything in there. I'm not sure what you're hearing, but that door should stay locked." I didn't like the way he said that, like there was something unsaid, something he wasn't telling me. "Do you want me to come by and check it out?" he offered, his voice tense. "I can unlock it." "No," I replied too quickly. "That's okay. We're fine." After I hung up, I regretted my answer. Maybe I did want him to come by, to open that door and reveal whatever was behind it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to know. That night, the knocking started. The next day was tense. Stacy noticed it right away. She always could tell when I was off, and I was more than off, I was on edge, ready to jump at the slightest sound. "You okay?" she asked over breakfast, her fork poking at the eggs on her plate. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," I admitted. There was noise again, from the locked room. Her face paled. "You heard it too?" I nodded, not wanting to scare her more than she already was. It was probably nothing. The house settling. You know how these old places are. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her eyes. But we didn't talk about it again. We spent the day hiking, trying to distract ourselves, but every step brought us back to the cabin, back to that locked door. When we returned that afternoon, Stacy went to take a nap while I sat in the living room, trying to focus on anything but the growing sense of dread that gnawed at me. But I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to see what was behind that door. I grabbed my phone and messaged the owner. "Come by. Open the door." His reply came quickly. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The wait was excruciating. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open on its own, revealing something horrible. But it stayed shut, as silent as ever. Finally, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel outside signaled the owner's arrival. He was an older man, his hair graying at the temples, and he looked just as uneasy as I felt. He nodded curtly when I opened the door for him, holding up a small key. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, unable to speak. He approached the door slowly, his hand shaking as he inserted the key into the lock. The click echoed through the quiet cabin like a gunshot. The door swung open with a groan. The room was dark, but as the light from the hallway spilled in, I saw it. A man, a tall, thin figure, stood in the middle of the room, his back to us. He was wearing a hooded jacket, the fabric loose and dirty. His head was down, but I could see his shoulders moving, swaying, as though he was dancing slowly to a rhythm only he could hear. "What the hell?" the owner muttered, stepping back. The figure froze. Slowly, he turned his head, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched taut over his skull. His eyes were sunken, black holes that seemed to swallow the light. And then he smiled. That smile, it wasn't human. It was too wide, too wrong, like his skin was being pulled back by invisible hands. My heart thundered in my chest, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by fear. He took a step toward us. "Get out," I shouted, grabbing the owner's arm and pulling him back. We bolted out of the house, slamming the front door behind us. My hands fumbled with the car keys as I yelled for Stacy, who rushed out of the cabin, wide-eyed and confused. "Get in the car," I shouted. Now, she didn't ask questions. She could see the terror on my face. We threw our bags in the trunk and sped away, the cabin disappearing in the rearview mirror. I called the owner later that evening, asking if the police had found anything. His voice was shaky. "The room was empty," he said, "but there were bags of chips, empty soda cans. Someone was in there. But they're gone now." We stayed in a nearby motel for the rest of the trip, but I couldn't shake the image of that man, of his too wide smile, his hollow eyes. I still see him sometimes in my nightmares, standing in the middle of that dark room, dancing to a rhythm I can't hear, waiting for the next time he can crawl out from the shadows. We stayed in the motel that night, a cheap, musty place with flickering lights and wallpaper peeling at the corners. But it was a relief, a sanctuary compared to that cabin. Stacy didn't speak much, but I could tell she was shaken. She hadn't seen the man, but she knew I had. And she trusted me enough not to question what I said. After tossing and turning for what felt like hours, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. But the nightmares came quickly, as they always do when your mind is already primed for fear. The cabin, the door, the man, his hollow eyes, and that terrible smile all danced behind my eyelids in a grotesque loop. In the dream, I stood in front of that locked door again, but this time the door opened by itself. He was there as before, swaying in the middle of the room. His hands moved, gesturing for me to come closer, beckoning. And then the smile too wide, too unnatural spread across his face again. But this time, it didn't stop. His mouth kept stretching, wider and wider, until it seemed like it would split his head in two. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Stacy was beside me, still asleep, but I could hear something. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, my body rigid, listening. It wasn't in the dream anymore, it was here. A soft knocking, slow and deliberate, coming from outside the motel room. My breath hitched, and I turned my head slowly toward the door. The sound was too familiar, too similar to what I had heard at the cabin. It can't be, I thought, my pulse racing. It can't be him. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to wake Stacy. My feet felt heavy, as if they were being pulled down by invisible chains, but I moved toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. Tap, tap, tap. I hesitated. Something deep inside me screamed not to open it, not to look. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't leave it alone. I opened the door. The night outside was still, the parking lot dimly lit by a flickering street lamp. But no one was there. The knocking had stopped, leaving behind an oppressive silence that settled over me like a weight. I stepped outside, looking both ways down the narrow walkway that stretched between the motel rooms. Nothing. Just the empty night. The air felt thick and cold, colder than it should have been for late October. I turned to go back inside, but then I saw it. There, just past the edge of the parking lot, near the woods that bordered the motel, was a figure. Standing perfectly still, just like he had in the cabin. It was him. My blood turned to ice. He was watching me, even from that distance. His hooded figure swayed slightly, almost imperceptibly, and even though I couldn't see his face, I knew he was smiling. I backed up into the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, bolting the chain across and stepping away as if the door itself were infected by his presence. What's going on? Stacy's voice came from behind me, groggy with sleep. I couldn't tell her. I couldn't make her panic the way I was. Nothing, I lied, trying to steady my breath. Go back to sleep. She stared at me for a moment, clearly not convinced, but she was too tired to press. She lay back down, and I stood there, staring at the door for what felt like hours, listening for any sound. Any knock. Anything. But the night remained quiet. The next morning, I made a decision. We weren't staying another night, not anywhere near this town. Whatever had been in that cabin, whatever had followed us, I wasn't giving it the chance to catch up. I packed up our things while Stacy showered, and by the time she came out, I was ready to go. We're leaving, I told her, my voice firm. What? Why? She looked confused, still half asleep. I can't explain it, Stacy, but I don't feel safe here. She must have seen the fear in my eyes, the way my hands shook as I zipped up my bag, because she didn't argue. We checked out of the motel and got in the car, heading south. I didn't care where we went, as long as it was far away from that cabin. From him. The drive was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hooded figure standing on the side of the road, watching us. But the miles stretched on, and nothing appeared. Slowly, the tension in my chest began to ease. We stopped for gas at a small station off the highway, and Stacy went inside to grab some snacks while I filled up the tank. The sun was high now, the morning fog burning away, and for the first time in days, I felt a little safer. The nightmare was behind us, or so I thought. I was leaning against the car, waiting for the tank to fill, when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, near the pumps, swaying ever so slightly. The same hooded figure, the same too thin frame. His face was hidden in shadow, but I didn't need to see it to know he was smiling. I froze, my blood running cold. How had he found us? How had he followed us this far? "Stacy," I yelled, panic rising in my throat. "Stacy, get in the car." She came running out of the gas station, a look of confusion on her face. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the car, my eyes never leaving the figure. But as we reached the door, he was gone. Disappeared as if he had never been there. Stacy looked at me, bewildered. "What are you talking about? There's no one here." I scanned the parking lot again, but she was right. He was gone. Just like at the motel. I didn't wait to explain. I shoved her into the passenger seat and climbed in, starting the car and speeding away from the gas station, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The drive was a blur after that. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, until we reached the state line. The further we got from that cabin, the lighter I felt, like a weight had been lifted from my chest. But the memory of that hooded figure stayed with me, haunting me in the quiet moments lurking at the edges of my mind. We made it home, but things were never the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. Stacy didn't believe me. She thought I was just traumatized by whatever had happened at the cabin, and maybe she was right. Maybe it was all in my head. But some nights, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. I tell myself it's nothing, just the wind or the house settling. But deep down, I know better. He's still out there, still watching, waiting. Story 2. The Girl on the Road. When you're driving at night, there's a certain calm that settles over you. The road is empty, the world feels quieter, and for a little while, it's just you and the darkness. But sometimes in that stillness, the night reveals things you wish it hadn't, things that creep in from the edges of your vision, things you can't explain. It was late October, a Friday night. I'd been to a Halloween party at my friend Tom's house, the kind of party where everyone half-heartedly throws on costumes and drinks until they forget the stress of the week. Tom had insisted I come, even though I wasn't really feeling it. I'd been dealing with some personal stuff, work stress, mostly, but also a bad breakup a few months earlier that had left me feeling pretty empty. The party was exactly what I'd expected. Loud music, people in cheap costumes laughing too hard at jokes that weren't funny, and the smell of beer hanging in the air. I stayed long enough to make it seem like I cared, but by midnight, I was itching to leave. The rain had started coming down hard about an hour before, and I figured it was as good an excuse as any to duck out early. I didn't bother saying goodbye to anyone. I slipped out the front door, pulled up the hood of my jacket, and made a run for my car. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and by the time I got inside and started the engine, I was already soaked. The streets were empty as I pulled out of Tom's neighborhood, and the rain was so heavy it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of me. The wipers struggled to keep up, swishing back and forth like they were fighting a losing battle. I wasn't in any hurry, So I drove slowly, the sound of the rain pounding on the roof like a relentless drumbeat. The roads were dark, the streetlights few and far between, casting long, flickering shadows on the pavement. It was the kind of night that made you feel alone, like the rest of the world had disappeared, and you were the only one left. About halfway home, I saw her. She was walking along the side of the road. No umbrella, no jacket, just a pale dress clinging to her body, drenched from head to toe. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and she moved slowly, almost like she wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. At first, I thought maybe she was coming from a party, maybe she was drunk and trying to walk off the buzz. But something about her seemed off. I slowed down, trying to get a better look. She didn't seem to notice me. Her eyes were downcast, her steps slow and deliberate, like she didn't care that she was out in the middle of a storm. I thought about driving past her. It was late, and I didn't know her, and I figured it wasn't really my business. But as I passed her, something tugged at the back of my mind, and I found myself pulling over. I rolled down the window just enough for the rain to splatter against the side of the car. "Hey," I called out. "You need a ride?" For a moment, she didn't respond. She just kept walking, her head down, her pace steady. But then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the car, opening the back door and sliding into the seat behind me. The temperature in the car dropped the second she got in. It wasn't just the rain, something about her presence felt cold, like she had brought the chill of the storm inside with her. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, and for the first time, I got a good look at her face. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with pale skin and dark, wide eyes that seemed to take in everything and nothing at the same time. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her dress, some old-fashioned thing that looked out of place, was soaked through, clinging to her body like a second skin. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "You live around here?" She didn't answer right away. She just stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. For a moment, I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. But then, in a soft, distant voice, she said, "Just down the road." Her voice sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't right. It was too soft, too hollow, like she was speaking from somewhere far away. But I nodded and started driving again, the car inching forward through the rain. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof and the occasional swish of the windshield wipers. I kept glancing at her in the mirror, but she didn't move. She didn't say anything. She just stared straight ahead, her face expressionless. Something was wrong. I could feel it. The air in the car felt thick, heavy, like I was breathing in something more than just rain-soaked air. I wanted to ask her more questions, where she was going, why she was out here in the middle of a storm, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like something was keeping me from speaking. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I didn't like this. I didn't like any of this. But I couldn't just drop her off in the middle of nowhere, not in this weather. So I kept driving. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "You need to stop." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the rain like a knife. I glanced at her in the mirror again, but she hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. "Stop?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Why?" "Just stop." There was something in her voice, something commanding, like she wasn't asking. She was telling me. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I considered ignoring her. But before I knew what I was doing, my foot pressed down on the brake, and the car came to a stop on the side of the road. We were in the middle of nowhere, just a dark stretch of road surrounded by trees and fields. The rain was still coming down hard, and the world outside the car was nothing but a blur of shadows and water. I turned to look at her, my heart racing. "What are we doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her hand and pointed out the window towards something in the distance. I squinted through the rain, trying to see what she was pointing at, and then I saw it. A cemetery. It was just beyond the bend in the road, hidden behind a rusted iron gate. The gravestones were old, worn down by time and weather, their inscriptions barely visible in the dim light. The rain had turned the ground into mud, and puddles of water reflected the faint glow of the streetlights. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "This is where I need to go," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. I stared at her, my heart pounding. "You want to go to the cemetery? Now?" She nodded slowly, her eyes meeting mine in the mirror. There was something in her gaze, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't peace either. It was like she was waiting for something she knew I couldn't understand. I hesitated, my mind racing. Everything about this felt wrong. But there was something in her eyes, something that made me feel like I had no choice. I put the car in park and turned off the engine. The rain was still coming down hard, and I could feel the cold seeping in through the windows. I didn't want to get out of the car, but I knew I couldn't leave her here alone. She opened the door and stepped out into the rain, her pale dress clinging to her body as she made her way toward the cemetery gate. I followed her, the mud squelching under my shoes as I walked. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the rain seemed to muffle every sound except for our footsteps. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The gravestones stood like silent sentinels, their weathered faces turned toward the sky. The rain had turned the ground into a swamp, and I could feel the mud pulling at my shoes with every step. She led me deeper into the cemetery, her steps slow and deliberate. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, even though I had no idea what we were doing here. Finally, she stopped in front of a small, unremarkable gravestone near the back of the cemetery. The name carved into the stone was worn and faded, but I could just make it out. Allison Harper. My blood ran cold. She knelt down in front of the gravestone, her fingers tracing the letters of her name. Her shoulders shook, and for a moment, I thought she might be crying. "This is where it happened," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where he left me." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "What do you mean? Who left you?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring at the gravestone, her fingers tracing the letters over and over again. I wanted to run. I wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by the cold, by the rain, by her. She stood up slowly, her eyes locking onto mine. "I've been waiting," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Waiting for someone to bring me back." "Back?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "Back to where?" Her eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw something else in her expression, anger. "Back to where it happened," she said, her voice growing colder. "Back to the place where I died." My heart skipped a beat. "Where did you die?" She pointed again, this time toward the road. Just down the road. The rain was still pouring down in relentless sheets, the sound of it battering against the ground and gravestones like a constant muted roar. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at her pale hand as she pointed toward the road. Just down the road, her voice echoed in my head, soft yet commanding. I didn't want to go. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get back in the car and leave this place behind. But I couldn't move. There was something about her, something about the way she looked at me, that made it impossible to ignore her. She wasn't just a lost girl asking for help. There was a weight in her words, a kind of inevitable pull that I couldn't escape. "Take me there," she whispered again, her eyes boring into mine. I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts, but they were scattered, lost in the rising panic that was building in my chest. "Okay," I croaked, my voice barely audible over the storm. "I'll take you." Her lips curled into the faintest smile, but it wasn't a smile of joy or gratitude. It was a sad, knowing smile, like she'd been expecting this all along. Like she knew I had no choice but to do as she asked. I turned and trudged back through the mud, my shoes sinking into the wet ground with each step. The cemetery seemed to close in around me, the gravestones looming like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting her to vanish again like she had before. But she was still there, walking slowly behind me, her head lowered, her dress clinging to her as the rain continued to pour. We reached the car, and I slid into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I could feel her presence behind me, heavy and cold, like a weight pressing down on my chest. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence that filled the car was suffocating, thick with unspoken words and the chill of something far beyond my understanding. I started the engine, and the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the winding road ahead. The rain was still coming down hard, but I could just make out the bend in the road that she had pointed to. The place where it had happened. The place where she had died. I drove slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Every inch of me wanted to turn around, to drive as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But I couldn't. I was trapped. Trapped by her, by this night, by the dark pull of whatever fate had brought me to this moment. As we rounded the bend, I saw it. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches twisted and gnarled, dripping with rain. The asphalt was cracked and worn, the puddles reflecting the dim light of the car's headlights. And there, at the edge of the road, was a small clearing, overgrown with weeds and thick, tangled grass. "This is it," she whispered from the back seat. I stopped the car, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt heavier here, thick with the weight of something I couldn't explain. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the oppressive silence remained. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, my stomach twisting with fear. She wasn't looking at me anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the clearing, her face pale and emotionless. For a moment, I thought she might get out of the car, but she didn't move. She just sat there, staring, as if waiting for something to happen. "This is where it happened," she said again, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "This is where I died." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What happened? For a long time, she didn't respond. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, until I wasn't sure if she was going to answer at all. But then, slowly, she began to speak. "He left me here," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was raining, just like tonight. We were driving down this road, and we argued. He got angry, said I was worthless, said no one would miss me if I was gone." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my pulse quickening. "I told him to stop the car," she continued. "I thought I could walk. I thought I could get away from him. But he didn't stop." Her voice broke, and for the first time, I heard a tremor of emotion in her tone. "He kept driving. He pushed me out, left me in the road. I tried to run, but—" She trailed off, her breath hitching in her throat. I didn't make it. My stomach twisted with a sickening sense of dread. The pieces were falling into place now, and the picture they formed was horrifying. She had been left for dead on this road, abandoned by someone who was supposed to care for her. And now she was here, reliving it, trapped in some nightmarish loop that I couldn't begin to understand. I waited, she whispered, her voice shaking. I waited for someone to come. But no one did. No one ever came. A tear slipped down her cheek, mingling with the rain, still clinging to her skin. I waited so long. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there were no answers. Only questions, only fear. Why? Why me? I asked, my voice trembling. Why did you come to me? For a moment, she didn't answer. She just stared at the clearing, her expression unreadable. But then, slowly, she turned her head to meet my eyes in the mirror. Because you were the only one who stopped. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. But deep down, I knew she was right. I had been the one to stop. I had been the one to bring her here, to the place where it had all ended. She didn't speak again after that. She just sat there, staring at the clearing, lost in her own memories, her own pain. The rain had stopped now, leaving only the quiet patter of water dripping from the trees. I didn't know how long we sat there, but eventually something in me broke. I couldn't stay here any longer. I couldn't keep reliving this nightmare with her. I had to leave. I had to get away. Without saying a word, I put the car in drive and pulled away from the clearing. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. She was gone. The back seat was empty, just as it had been before. No trace of her, no sign that she had ever been there at all. But the weight of her presence lingered, a cold chill that wouldn't go away. I drove for hours after that, not knowing where I was going, not caring. I just needed to be far away from that road, from that clearing, from her. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with me, that she was still waiting. Waiting for someone to bring her back. It's been months since that night, but it still haunts me. I see her in my dreams, standing by the side of the road, her pale dress clinging to her body, her eyes dark and hollow. I hear her voice in the rain, whispering, asking me to take her home. Sometimes I wonder if she'll ever find peace, if she'll ever stop waiting. But deep down, I know the truth. She'll never stop. Because she's not waiting for peace. She's waiting for someone else to stop. And next time, it might be you. Story 3. The Shadows Beneath the House. There's something about old houses that draws people in. Maybe it's the history, the idea that the walls have seen lifetimes come and go, that they hold the stories of people long dead. Or maybe it's just the sense of permanence, the thought that some things outlast us. For me, though, old houses have always felt like traps, places that lure you in with their charm and nostalgia, only to reveal that they hold secrets far darker than you could have imagined. The house I'm talking about belonged to my grandfather. He was a strange man, the kind who kept to himself and didn't like to talk much. I only saw him a few times when I was a kid, usually during the holidays when my parents would take us up to his place in the middle of nowhere. It was a big, sprawling house, Victorian style, with turrets and gables, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to stretch on forever. As a kid, I hated it. The house always felt wrong to me. There were too many shadows, too many creaking floors, and dark corners where the light never seemed to reach. And the basement, that was the worst. I'd heard my parents talk about it in hushed tones, how Grandpa never let anyone go down there. He had his projects, they said, things he worked on that no one else could see. I never knew what those projects were, and frankly, I didn't care. All I knew was that I never wanted to set foot in that basement. Grandpa passed away a few months ago. My parents, being his only living relatives, inherited the house. They didn't want to keep it, they lived too far away, and the upkeep on a place that size would be impossible, so they decided to sell it. But before they could do that, someone had to go up there and clean it out. My parents were busy, and my brother was too far away, so the job fell to me. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I didn't really have a choice. So one Friday morning, I packed up my car and made the drive up to the house. The closer I got, the more I felt that familiar sense of dread creeping over me. It was like the house knew I was coming, like it was waiting for me. When I pulled up the long gravel driveway, the house stood there, looming over the landscape like some kind of forgotten relic. The windows were dark, the paint peeling from the siding, and the front porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The woods surrounding the house seemed even thicker than I remembered, the trees casting long shadows that stretched across the lawn like skeletal fingers. I sat in the car for a few minutes, just staring at the house. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me in there. But I had no choice. The sooner I got this done, the sooner I could leave and never come back. I grabbed my backpack, got out of the car, and headed toward the front door. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. The wind whispered through the trees, but it didn't feel like a breeze. It felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to step inside. The key my parents had given me slid into the lock with a soft click, and the door creaked open. The smell hit me immediately: dust, mildew, and something else, something faint but unmistakable. It was the smell of decay, of something long dead. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, and flicked on the light switch. The overhead chandelier sputtered to life, casting a dim, flickering glow over the entryway. The house was exactly as I remembered it: dark wood paneling, old furniture covered in sheets, and that overwhelming sense of emptiness. I made my way through the house, room by room, opening windows to let in some air, pulling sheets off the furniture, and generally trying to make the place feel less oppressive. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt too still, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I worked my way through the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen, gathering up old papers and tossing out anything that looked like junk. But as I reached the hallway that led to the basement, I stopped. The door to the basement was closed, just as it had always been. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to go down there. I had to clean out the basement just like the rest of the house. But the thought of it made my skin crawl. Taking a deep breath, I walked over to the door and turned the handle. It opened with a groan, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the darkness. The smell hit me again, stronger this time, more pungent, like something was rotting down there. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and started down the stairs. The air grew colder the further down I went, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The flashlight's beam flickered as I reached the bottom of the stairs, illuminating the basement in a dim, sickly light. The basement was huge, much bigger than I'd remembered. It was filled with old furniture, boxes, and strange-looking tools that I didn't recognize. But it wasn't the clutter that caught my attention. It was the walls. They were covered in strange markings, symbols, drawings, and writing in a language I didn't understand. The symbols were crude, almost childlike, but there was something sinister about them. They covered every inch of the walls, stretching from floor to ceiling. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight over the symbols. They seemed to pulse in the light, almost as if they were alive. What the hell was Grandpa doing down here? I muttered to myself. As I moved further into the basement, I noticed something else: a door. It was tucked away in the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates. It wasn't like the other doors in the house. This one was made of metal, heavy and rusted, with thick bolts running along the edges. My heart raced as I approached the door. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. But I couldn't stop myself. I reached out and grabbed the handle, my hand trembling. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. The air that rushed out was cold, much colder than the rest of the basement, and it carried with it a faint foul odor. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped through the door. The hallway was long and narrow, the walls lined with more of those strange symbols. The further I went, the worse the smell became. It was the stench of decay, of something long dead and rotting. As I reached the end of the hallway, I found myself standing in front of another door. This one was smaller, made of the same heavy metal as the first, and it was locked. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with the lock, using an old key I'd found on a hook in the kitchen. It took a few tries, but finally the lock clicked and the door swung open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was small, no bigger than a closet, and it was filled with bones. Human bones. They were piled up in the corner, skulls and ribs and femurs tangled together in a grotesque heap. The stench of death was overwhelming, and I gagged, covering my mouth and nose with my hand. I backed out of the room, my heart racing. What the hell was this? What had Grandpa been doing down here? I stumbled back through the hallway, my flashlight flickering as I went. I had to get out of here. I had to leave this house and never come back. But as I reached the stairs, I heard something. A faint whisper, coming from the darkness behind me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The whisper grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. And then I saw it. A shadow darker than the rest, moving along the wall. It wasn't like the shadows cast by my flashlight. It was something else, something alive. I backed up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow followed me, slithering along the walls like smoke. It whispered to me, its voice low and guttural, but I couldn't understand the words. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the basement door shut behind me, locking it. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I knew I had to get out of this house. I ran to the front door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, the door refusing to move no matter how hard I pulled. Panic set in. I was trapped. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and tried to call my parents, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. And then I heard it again, the whispering. It was coming from all around me now, filling the house, growing louder with each passing second. I backed away from the door, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The shadows were moving again, crawling across the walls, converging toward me like a thick, suffocating fog. They didn't move like normal shadows. They slithered, undulating, as if they were alive, like something inhuman was hiding within them, just out of sight. My breath came in ragged gasps as the cold, clammy air closed in around me, pressing against my skin like icy fingers. I stumbled backward into the living room, my eyes darting around for any sign of an escape, but the windows were sealed shut, the old warped wood swollen from years of neglect. I was trapped in here, and the house knew it. The shadows continued to close in, creeping along the floor and walls, reaching out toward me like tendrils of darkness. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, the temperature in the room plummeting with every second. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many an unintelligible cacophony of low, guttural tones, echoing from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air itself. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt wrong, ancient, as though they didn't belong to this world. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move. I couldn't stay still. I couldn't let whatever was lurking in those shadows reach me. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline pushing me forward as I dashed for the staircase that led to the second floor. I didn't know why, maybe some primal instinct for higher ground, but the idea of staying on the ground floor, where the shadows were gathering, terrified me. I bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, the old wooden steps creaking under my weight. The whispering followed me, swirling up the stairwell like a cold breeze, the shadows crawling along the walls, growing darker and darker. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced back and froze. The shadows had taken shape. They weren't just creeping across the walls anymore. They were forming figures. Humanoid shapes, tall and thin, their bodies elongated and twisted, with no discernible faces, just empty black voids where eyes should have been. They stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching me, their presence radiating a malevolent, suffocating energy. I tore my gaze away and ran down the hallway, my flashlight beam swinging wildly as I searched for somewhere to hide, somewhere to escape. I reached the first door on the left, one of the old guest bedrooms, and threw it open. The room was dark, the air heavy with the musty scent of old linens and forgotten memories. I slammed the door shut behind me, my back pressed against the wood as I tried to catch my breath. The house was silent now, the whispering gone, but the oppressive cold remained. I could feel the weight of the shadows pressing against the door, pushing against the wood, testing it. I shined the flashlight around the room, searching for something, anything that could help me. The beam landed on an old wardrobe in the corner, a large, imposing piece of furniture that had always unnerved me as a child. I didn't have time to think. I rushed toward it, wrenching the doors open. Inside, the wardrobe was empty, except for a few dusty hangers swaying gently, as though someone had disturbed them recently. I climbed inside, pulling the doors shut behind me, and crouched in the darkness, my breath shallow and fast. For a moment, there was silence. A thick, oppressive silence that pressed down on me, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, the thudding of my heart in my ears. But beneath that, I could hear something else. A faint, scratching sound like nails scraping against wood. It was coming from inside the wardrobe. My blood ran cold, and I pressed myself against the back of the wardrobe, trying to distance myself from the sound. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out of the wood itself. I reached for the door handles, ready to bolt out of the wardrobe, when the scratching stopped. Silence. I held my breath, my hand trembling on the door handle. And then, slowly, the doors began to creak open on their own. My flashlight flickered to life just as the doors swung wide, and I was met with darkness. A darkness so deep and absolute that it swallowed the light from the flashlight. It wasn't just the wardrobe anymore. The walls of the room had disappeared, replaced by an endless void of shadow. The floor beneath me felt unstable, like it was sinking into the darkness itself, and the cold was so intense that my skin burned with it. And then I saw them. Figures twisted, faceless forms, emerging from the darkness, their limbs impossibly long, their bodies swaying as they moved toward me. Their whispering voices filled the room again, louder now, more insistent, like they were calling to me, demanding something from me. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the wardrobe, and I fell hard to the floor. The flashlight slipped from my hand, rolling across the floor and coming to a stop just outside the wardrobe. The beam flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room, but the light was swallowed by the advancing figures. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse racing, and ran toward the door. I had to get out of this room, out of this house. But as I reached for the doorknob, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. The figures were closer now. I could feel the cold radiating off of them, could hear the low, guttural sounds they made as they moved closer. My back was pressed against the door, my hand frantically searching for the knob, but it was gone. There was no way out. The shadows closed in, their whispering voices filling my ears, their presence overwhelming, suffocating. My vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin around me. I felt the ground give way beneath me, felt myself falling into the darkness. And then everything went silent. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the living room, the faint light of dawn filtering through the windows. The shadows were gone. The house was quiet, empty, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I could feel it in my bones. The house was still watching me, waiting. The shadows hadn't left. They were just hiding, waiting for the next time I dared to venture into the basement. I got to my feet, my body aching, and stumbled toward the front door. This time, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. I stepped outside, the cool morning air washing over me like a cleansing wave. I didn't look back as I climbed into my car and drove away. I couldn't. The house was behind me now, but the shadows were still with me. I could feel them lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And I knew, deep down, that one day I would have to return. Because the house wasn't finished with me. Not yet. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.